Good evening, one and all, and thank you for joining us back here at Movie Club this week. But I definitely wanted to cover this bonus screening because it's absolutely fascinating, and it comes from one of my favorite directors of all time. Of course, tonight we're covering the fantastic PSA from director George A. Romero, The Amusement Park. Now, for a little bit of context, this film was considered lost for a number of years, but that is slightly not true.
Well, it was a film. It wasn't really a film. It was more an industrial PSA, and it was commissioned by the Lutheran Senior Life. And Karl Rabenik, who was the producer, was approached by them and asked them if they knew a director. And he said, yes, I know George Romero. And so George did this film or shot it in 3 days at Westview Park, and it was a 3-day shoot, bing bang boom, and forgotten essentially. It was shown at community centers as a precursor to programs such as Meals on Wheels and other supportive programs that they were looking to establish at the time. And and it was just basically tucked away and kind of just disappeared, and George never really mentioned it because it wasn't anything, it wasn't a film that was supposed to be broadly distributed.
What it really means is there wasn't a great print of it available, and it really wasn't heralded by the director himself because it's the only job he ever did for hire. You heard me right. This is the only film that George A. Romero ever made being hired by someone else. He typically made the stuff that he wanted to make and kept to himself. But this is the one time that he was hired to do something else. And let me tell you, it's absolutely fascinating because he was hired by the Lutheran Society of America to make a PSA on the horrors that face the elderly here in American culture.
Just the reality of Romero taking this job, or the idea of Romero in between creating iconic, game-changing horror films, taking a job for hire to keep working, to keep going at his craft. I mean, he did sports documentaries, he did beer commercials, he would anything to break out the camera and keep going. I think is something that I think it's a really interesting lesson in this film, because Romero didn't just sit around and wait for an opportunity. He didn't wait for something to be handed to him. He kept going, and if it was filming Mr. Rogers' tonsillectomy, so be it. He's going to go film Mr. Rogers' tonsillectomy.
And there's no one that's better at critiquing American culture than the master of the zombie subgenre himself, George A. Romero. Romero was no stranger to this, but if I were to delve any more into this film right now, before we get started, I think that would be doing you a disservice. As we've been doing with all these smaller reviews, I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock on the big screen, and I'm going to talk about the movie as much as I possibly can in that time allotted, and then we will move on with the screening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts after the film, but in order to do that, in order to screen the film, we need to put 5 minutes on this dang clock and get started right away. I'm not TCM, so really I have no business doing this, but regardless, it doesn't matter. So this helps you stay sane and not have to listen to me ramble on for well over an hour. I'm not known for my brevity, but this helps keep me nice and concise, so without further ado, let's get this bad boy on the road. And here we go. As I previously mentioned, tonight's screening is the fantastic lost film from George A. Romero, The Amusement Park. But to call it a film would be maybe a bit misleading, because this is a PSA, and it does feel like that at times. It is bookended by 2 sequences with the main actor in the piece telling you why this piece exists, how it came to be made, and all the requisite parts, and hopefully tell you the thing that you need to know and maybe an action that you can do at the end of this piece. So it is framed like a PSA, and that is what it's supposed to be. George A. Romero was hired by the Lutheran Society of America to make a PSA on how American culture mistreats the elderly and people who are too old to necessarily take care of themselves. And honestly, as I said previously, there's no one better equipped to tackle American culture and dismantle it from the inside than George A. Romero. I mean, he's been doing this since Night of the Living Dead from 1968, and he dug in even deeper just a couple years after this with his fantastic and genre-defining Dawn of the Dead, where he critiqued Reagan-era capitalism and really got in on that mall culture before malls sprung up all across America in the 80s. Romero's always had an insight, and one of the most important things I think I've noticed as I've rewatched his films across the pandemic era is that George has always been right. George is a really smart guy, and the sad thing to me is that our culture really hasn't evolved all that much since he was making movies all those years ago.
You know, often interviewers would ask him, Mr. Romero, what scares you? What film scares you, or what frightens you? Because it's, a man who creates all these horrific images. And he always said, life. Life scares me. And this is a perfect film for that.
And the fact that this piece is now cycled around from being pretty much not seen by anybody to on the big screen again, thanks to places like Sidewalk Film Center and Cinema right here in Birmingham, Alabama, and a couple other theaters around the United States, it's kind of sad that this movie was buried, because honestly, it's one of his best works. Even as a PSA, and even at its short run time of 53 minutes, there was so much to dig into here. The fantastic casting on this also is amazing. Maisel, who is the main actor here, who plays our unnamed protagonist, who has a hellish day in an amusement park out of one's worst nightmares, is really an allegory for how we as a society, especially American society, treat the elderly, and how it's such a short-sighted thing to treat the elderly so poorly, because inevitably we're going to become them.
I don't know how he met Lincoln, because this obviously would have been his first meet. But Lincoln was, in fact, the only guild member on the set. So he was paid. And then after the shoot, he donated his fee to the film. So obviously a lovely human being. And he died at 103 years old. And his grandchildren said that he lived a beautiful, long life. And, really, that's really all I know.
And in one of its most haunting lines, in the way that the PSA closes, is this brilliant piece of dialogue delivered by our host. I'll see you in the park someday. When I say that line gave me chills, I absolutely mean it. It was a devastating way to end this PSA, and proves that Romero, even now in 1971, was at the top of his craft. He'd only just gotten started a couple years prior in 1968 with his really, really, really independent film, Night of the Living Dead, which changed cinema forever, but The Amusement Park continues to show his mastery of the craft. One of the things I do have to warn you about this film is that it is very disorienting and sometimes really hard to watch. And that's by design. It's designed to be confusing, and it really feels like an art house indie film. And that's largely because that's kind of the world that Romero comes from. But also because he wants you to feel the way that the main character in this piece does. He wants you to be agonizing by the end of this piece. He wants you to feel the tension and the horror that this man is experiencing. And it's brilliant because of that. It puts you in this guy's shoes so effortlessly and continues this fantastic pacing where you never really get a grasp on anything before you're moved on to the next vignette, equally terrifying as the prior one, and even more damning of our culture.
You had mentioned it did screen a bit, and it screened with the intent of getting the message out, settings that would provide this context. I'm curious about the history after it. Did the Lutheran Society not deem it working? Did they not enjoy what was created?
I'm thinking what they received was probably a little edgier than they had anticipated. They never actually said that, but you have to think that was probably their thoughts.
It's absolutely fascinating that Romero was still so on top of how to critique society around him, even in 1971, a couple years prior to Dawn of the Dead. But this is a guy who spent his entire career making his money and making his living off of making these kinds of movies. So really, it shouldn't be all that surprising. One of the things I think that interests me the most about this particular piece is that as a lost film now being rediscovered in 2021, it feels like an extra film that we get from Romero, who passed away in 2017, and long before he really got the credit that he was due.
And And maybe that's why, because when I started the process of getting this film restored, I was desperate for another print. And I was hoping that they would have a print. And so when I called them and said, do you have it in your archives? Do you have a record of you commissioning this film? They had neither. So they just didn't, I guess they just didn't think it was worthy of keeping. I'm not quite sure what their intent was afterwards, but they didn't have a record of it.
This is a man who made his bread and butter on commercials in the Pittsburgh area, including directing a couple episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and then scrounged together enough money and enough people who were willing to follow him on some madman's journey to make a little independent film. And that little independent film happened to be Night of the Living Dead, a film that arguably is one of the most important things ever to be made in cinema, but especially independent cinema. Romero paved the way for people to just make movies on their own terms, and because they desired to make great art. Romero never asked for permission, but always delivered the goods. He always found a way to deliver the most damning critique of society around him, whilst also being one of the most positive and adored people in the Pittsburgh area. If you listen to the people that were on his cast or his crews, they absolutely adored working with the man, saying he's one of the nicest and most collaborative people they've ever worked with. So it's nice to know that this guy who was, incredibly cynical or pessimistic about society and very insightful throughout his entire career was also one of the most loving and kind people. And I think that's something that we should take into account. We don't have to deify artists that are bad people. We should definitely celebrate the ones that made great art and at the same time were great people.
It's been so easy for so many of us who came to Hollywood from Pittsburgh. We've all done quite well, and that's thanks to George. He really mentored, and he may not even have realized he was doing it.
That feels better.
And you think, who is this person who makes these horrible movies? It's this lovely, bright, sweet man that, you give 110% for because you want to. He's one of the best people I've ever known.
And I think the most beautiful thing about this guy is that he always knew, even as a guy in his 20s who had not even remotely begun to experience old age yet, or to be discounted by society as a worthless member now that they've grown to a certain age. He knew what it would be like, and he had the foresight to make a movie about it. Now, it was something that he was hired to do, but most people could have just phoned in the work here, made a PSA, just called it a day, and moved on with their lives. While Romero might have thought that's what he had done here, that he had just done a job and gotten paid for it in what was barely a 3-day shoot, I think he accomplished much more than even he gave credit to himself. Because Romero was never the most self-aggrandizing person. He always thought that maybe his work wasn't that important, but he was making good media that he really enjoyed. He would always downplay his success and always downplay anything that maybe his art was really doing for the world of cinema at large. And I think that's why I celebrate him as a hero. Even here in a work that pretty much anyone I know would have phoned in just to get the paycheck, Romero does something special. He makes something timeless, and something all these years later, over 50 years later, that feels so contemporary. And that's something that only someone who is so committed to the craft could do. Romero might have seen this as just a paycheck, but man, if he doesn't put in more effort than anyone else I would know. And as someone who directed, was a cinematographer, and edited this piece, it shows the brilliant talent that's just at its beginning, that's just on its way up to its crescent. It's nice to feel like you're seeing an old friend again. And for anybody who's seen a Romero film and is now getting to experience this piece that many people thought was lost to time, well, it feels like we're seeing George Romero again. And maybe George thought that we would forget about him, but I think the good news is he's here to stay, because we still need him, and we still need his art to remind us that we as a society have so much work to do, and that we need to treat each other better. And isn't that just a great legacy to leave? Isn't that something that we always strive for, we should strive for, to leave a legacy behind of being kind to one another and in loving and respecting our collaborators and the people that we work with. And that when you watch one of his movies, you feel the love and the craft behind them. That's, I think, the George Romero effect. And it's why, if I had to say, Steven Spielberg made me love movies, but George A. Romero made me believe I can make them. And that's why George will always be my hero. And I hope tonight you'll get to see just a little bit of why that is for me. I know I've talked way over my time, but I hope this has been of some value to you setting up tonight's brilliant little short film. Though this film may be short, it knows what it's doing, and it will make you deeply uncomfortable in all the perfect and right ways. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy tonight's screening as much as you can. And I'll see you in the park as we, tonight here at Movie Club, proudly present the remastered in 4K version of George A. Romero's fantastic 1971 piece, The Amusement Park. I'll see you at the movies.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the park someday.